welcome to our philosophical talks with Steven Friedman. Thank you very much for joining us. And also, we would like to thank the U.S. Consul General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and our amazing speaker, scientist, philosopher, and artist, Steven Friedman. Also, the New York Times announced him as a great philosopher. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all for being here today with us. And today's topic is the philosophy of light and enlightenment. Thank you very much, Steven. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for the introduction. I also want to thank the American Consulate in Almaty, Consul General Eric Meyer, Elmira, Tracy, Dana, for facilitating these talks as an ongoing exercise in communicating philosophy to a broad public, dealing with a variety of issues that are not necessarily seen as philosophical, but that can be illuminated from a philosophical perspective. Remember, philosophy, in principle, addresses everything. It operates from the highest possible level of generality, and that means it can stand in, really, ultimately, in criticism of every other human activity and enterprise, especially things like the sciences that philosophy was actually the progenitor of, a number of centuries ago. Philosophers like Francis Bacon, the empiricist philosophers, even Newton considered himself a natural philosopher, as much philosopher as scientist, and that tradition continues into the present with eminent scientists such as Einstein and Heisenberg, who saw themselves as philosophically attuned as much as attuned towards their work and their investigations in physics. In fact, their philosophical grounding made it possible for them to engineer their groundbreaking results in the physical sciences. So, philosophy applies to everything. It applies to considerations of light. Now, I announced tonight's topic as light and enlightenment. As I sort of think about it, like I usually present the topic at the beginning of the week. And sometimes, and this is one of those times, I'll start getting more and more ideas about one particular aspect of the talk. Originally, I was thinking of dividing the talk between light and enlightenment. It's International Day of Light, I think May 16th. It's also Buddha Day on May 26th. So I thought I would bring those two topics together in a talk on light and enlightenment, but my thinking about the light portion has actually expanded, and I'm not entirely sure. I don't practice these in advance, and I think about them. I go through them. Every time I go through a talk like this in preparation, it takes a different form, a different course. That's part of the nature of philosophy, to be specific to time and place and circumstance. It's part of its precision. Well, the light portion expanded. So I'm actually not sure if I will actually have enough time to address both topics. If it looks like I'm not going to be able to devote adequate time to the enlightenment portion, I'll just address that next week. So this talk might extend over 2 weeks, and the preponderance of tonight will be devoted to light itself, from a variety of perspectives, scientific, but also artistic and philosophical. And as I think has become customary with these talks, I'll be presenting some poetry that addresses some of these issues, and I'll be discussing some comments by individuals who have sort of contributed to the human understanding of phenomenon of light. Well, when the topic presented itself to me, the first thing that entered my mind were Goethe's final words. I've referred to the German philosopher, poet, dramatist, scientist too, Goethe, a late 18th, early 19th century figure who was a titan of European thought and intellectual currents. He's considered probably the greatest poet in the history of the German language, and has been admired not just for his artistic production, but for the wisdom he acquired in a lifetime of sort of careful processing of experience. The prominent English man of letters, Samuel Johnson, once said the most stirring of all spectacles was that of a powerful mind operating upon experience. Well, Goethe is such a mind. I've mentioned before that he was Einstein's favorite writer, and he's one of mine. So his final words occurred to me, and his final words were light, more light. Now, the poignancy of that coheres with something else that he wrote, an aphorism. He said, "Death is an impossibility that one day becomes an actuality." And it was that moment that transition occurred. Now, when we say death is an impossibility, actually, death is always an impossibility epistemically. Right? It only becomes an actuality heuristically from the outside, from the standpoint of someone else's experience, not our own. So the actuality of it is a heuristic actuality. And I've stressed repeatedly that the heuristic is not the incontestable reality that philosophy investigates and embraces. The heuristic is the approximations that facilitate technology, science, society, political enterprise, political engagement, and language itself is heuristic. So, in fact, I wrote an aphorism just a few days ago. Epistemically, there is no death or other people. And that comment actually is something that would probably be embraced by figures such as Anne Frank, Mother Teresa, the French philosopher Sartre. Remember, Anne Frank had written towards the end of her life about her aspirations for herself that she thought were possible for her to achieve if there were no other people in the world. And Mother Teresa famously remarked, it was always and only between her and God, despite a life of engagement and compassion, in service to others. But it was the connection between herself and God that she saw her life and her enterprise as representing, as embracing. And in Sartre, the 20th century French existentialist philosopher, author of Being and Nothingness, also the play No Exit, famously remarked, hell is other people. Well, from my perspective, presumption is hell, but other people represent a presumption in the sense that we cannot, in principle, enter someone's consciousness. We imagine that we are engaging with other consciousnesses, with other sentient beings, human beings with an inner life, because of language itself, because of our ability to communicate with other people. It's the communicative interaction that creates the aura of an inner life in other people. But it's not something that we can rigorously validate. And so it's not part of epistemic space. Ultimately, salvation is singular. And that was something embraced even by a Christian philosopher such as Kierkegaard, who emphasized that on his tombstone, only two words would be necessary: the individual. And in Buddhism, in the early tradition, there's a famous Buddhist sutra poem, "Fair lonely as rhinoceros." Again, an emphasis on the singularity of salvation. Well, we've deviated a little bit from the issue of light, but Goethe was, as I said, preeminently a poet. He wrote a lot of lyric poetry, but he also wrote dramatic works in poetic form, as Shakespeare, for example. His most famous work was Faust, a work that actually he wrote in two parts. The first part early in his life, the second part after a gap of many years, he completed actually shortly before his death. So his life had that sense of completeness, that his masterwork was completed just in time. But to give you a sense of how Goethe and pre-20th century poetry would be written, would be constituted, here's the conclusion to Goethe's Faust, part 2. All things transitory, but his symbols are sent. Life's insufficiency here grows to event. The indescribable, here it is done. The eternal feminine draws us on. Now, again, that was written late in his life. Death was in the air. And those last words about the eternal feminine drawing us on actually invokes from a Hindu deity, Kali, the goddess of death. There's a hymn in the Hindu tradition to Kali that goes, "Thou, mother of blessings, thou, terrible night, night of delusion, night of death, we greet thee." So it's maybe partly in that sense that Goethe's final words to Faust were also conceived, possibly. Notice one aspect of the poetry of Goethe, and much, again, pre-20th century poetry, it's communicating ideas, observations, perhaps. Its fundamental unit is really the line, maybe we can call it a sentence in many cases, a stanza, like a paragraph of prose. It's communicating, though, ideational content, ideas, observations, as I said. 20th century poetry and contemporary poetry often moves in a different direction, has a different aspiration, and is certainly represented in much of the poetry that I've written, where the unit of meaning is not fundamentally the line or the stanza equivalent to a paragraph, right? It's the word or the phrase, where as you read the poem, you're sort of focused on the piece word by word and considering as you read it, if you're reading it sufficiently slowly, what anticipations does a given word introduce? What's the mood? What's the tone? And a lot of the process of writing the poem and reading the poem is experiencing the contrasts. You have certain words that set up expectations that additional words, subsequent words either validate or thwart in some significant way. And it's in that manner that the poem communicates, not as a sentence, but as a word by word exploration or journey. To illustrate that, I selected a poem that's actually the final poem of one of my books of poetry. The book is called Round, Round. The poem, and you'll see why I chose it, and what this whole introduction is leading up to, partly. The poem is called Light. And as I said, it concludes a book of poetry. The air rose light, chaste. There was no haste, this repose of night. Sight laced bright, traced white, currents bright by this very night. Slight sense might tempt, might try the rare height. Fight for rarer air, past care, fair night, and stare aware of light, as hair laced slender, slight, full and fair, this unimaginable night of light-laced air. A very different type of poetic experience than what I recited of Garretts, right? It's not communicating ideas in the way that Garretts' work was, and that a lot of traditional poetry does. If you're reading 20th century and 21st century poetry and you find it difficult, you find it obscure, you find it arcane, inaccessible in some way, slow down, read it more slowly, and read it, if you can, more word by word, phrase by phrase, as I was outlining, because that's how I wrote that poem, and that's how I write most of my poetry. Okay? So it's a matter of individuation, where the unit of meaning is becoming more and more atomistic. It's becoming, again, not so much of a line conveying a specific meaning, but individual words. So it has that density where each word carries significant weight. And the procession of words, is what is conveying the meaning. Okay? A similar process, actually, or an analogous process, can be pointed to in the history of art, visual art. In pre-20th century, actually pre-mid-19th century art, the focus typically was on representing an image. Like when we think of the Mona Lisa, it's the image overall that matters. We can't even, in general, detect, for example, the individual components. The individual components of a painting or traditional painting would be a brushstroke, right? That would correspond to the words, of language. Well, when Leonardo was painting the Mona Lisa, he would paint in very thin layers. He didn't want the brushstrokes to be apparent. He wanted the brushstrokes to be almost translucent and to cohere only to create the overall image, the mood, the mystery, of the work itself. Okay? The brushstroke was not the vehicle of fundamental meaning of the work. That changes in the mid-19th century, and it changes fundamentally, or most conspicuously, most emphatically, in the art of Impressionism. And again, we see the connection with tonight's topic, because Impressionism is seen as the art of light. Fundamentally, 19th century painters were drawn to the phenomenon of light. There was a lot of study of light taking place in physics. The great physicist Maxwell was elucidating the fundamental nature of light as an electromagnetic phenomenon. He was the one who laid the groundwork, actually, for the subsequent work of Einstein. But so there was a lot of interest in the nature of art, nature of light, which had been going back really a few centuries, as we'll see soon. The Impressionists, and I'm thinking of artists like Monet. The Impressionists were interested in representing the elusiveness of the phenomenon of light. They wanted to create a work of art, a painting that breathed light. And they did that by basically liberating the brushstroke, so that the brushstroke becomes a conspicuous feature of the work. And we see that in the work of the Impressionists. We see that in work of, again, like Monet, where the surface is scintillating. It's like alive. And I can, let me just show you an image of a Monet, a famous work. He did a series of, and to show you the fascination that the Impressionists had with art. Monet would do series of works devoted to a single subject, like haystacks. And he would capture the subject at different times of day when the light was fundamentally different. So one subject, one motif, one haystack could become the occasion for dozens of paintings where each one was distinctive in terms of the play of light that Monet was capturing. Here, again, let me just pull this up so you can see. Here's an example of the haystack. Now you see, it's like a radiant work. And you can, I think you can see even here, individual brushstrokes are apparent in that work. From even, from a distance, you can see that it's made up of these components that the eye is bringing together, right? But the individual construction of the work remains apparent in the final executed image, right? And it's not just the image that matters, but how that image is constructed out of those distinct, separated applications of paint. That interest in the individual brushstroke as the conveyor, of meaning, infuses my art. And it's something that led to a whole series of works. You see examples behind me that my art dealer originally characterized as light worlds, where I am painting on clear acrylic rods. They're like clear plastic. I've shown you some examples in the past, but that's like an example of the pole. I'm painting on the back of the poles, and each one of these applications of paint is one brushstroke. One. So this work is made up of 7 brushstrokes. That's it. But what you're seeing here is the exterior. You're seeing the like what you would see on the surface of a Monet, what you would see on the surface of a Cézanne, or on the surface of a Van Gogh and a Cezanne, Van Gogh might be made up of 1,000 of these. But because I'm painting them on these poles, you can look through the pole and see the actual image. These images represent, again, one single brushstroke, one application of paint, but each image is a world. So it's as if in one brushstroke now, I have a complete painterly vista. Yeah, as if each one of these images could be blown up the size of a wall and create a work that's actually on the boundary between abstraction and representation. Now, that's part of what these works are doing. But there's another important feature of them, and why the art was called light worlds, and why the art has actually been described by various dealers as exhibiting the greatest mastery of light that they'd encountered. And I say that not, not as a personal aggrandizement, but just to convey how the art has been experienced, partly because it's hard to communicate, it's hard to represent it well in this medium, right, that we're communicating with over. So the idea behind the way these works deal with light and their relationship to light is the following. Originally, I started doing pastels. When I first began to paint, I was interested in pastels, partly because they were a difficult medium. I didn't know if I had any talent, and I thought that would be a challenge. One of my favorite artists was Degas, an impressionist, post-impressionist, both. Degas was a master of pastel, and his pastels were some of the most compelling works of art that I knew. So I did pastels, and I've shown you a couple of examples. I'm going to show you an example right here. It's an early work, but it has something in common with the impressionist preoccupation with light. Here's the pastel, if you can see it. And you can see it's of a girl outside. Light is playing off her hair. You can see light playing off the trees and on the ground. Okay, so it has an impressionist feel to it. But it's a pastel, again, like Degas. The one thing about pastels, though, is they're granular. They're like chalk. And if you shine strong light on them, the surface scatters that light and sort of washes out the image. These pastels, in general, can only be properly appreciated in dimmer light, which is partly by design. If they were exposed to strong light, they would fade over time. Some years ago, I went to a prominent local art museum, the Norton Simon Art Museum, that happens to have a famous collection of Degas pastels, and they were all faded. That's what happens to pastel over time. Pastel does not respond well to strong light. Well, being drawn to the phenomenon of light, I wanted art that could receive as intense light as possible. I wanted the art not to be washed out by the light, but to be elevated, to embody the experience of light itself. And that's what these poles are designed to do, in the sense that, well, for one thing, the poles are magnifying the images. And they're changing the images. So as you move, or as you move the pole, the images fundamentally change. Again, it's hard to appreciate. I understand in this setting, but still, you can get a little bit of idea. And the more slowly you move, the more the images reveal. Okay, so the art actually has an enormous amount of content because as you see them from different directions, the images change. Okay? And they're also designed to be read, experienced, actually, from top to bottom. They tell a story, but they're right on the boundary between abstraction and representation. So the story that they tell depends partly upon what the viewer brings to the experience. Well, one of the fundamental aspects of this art, though, is given the curvature of the poles are actually concentrating light, drawing in light onto the imagery from 180 degrees, from all different directions. When I first did these works, I was doing them actually in the garage of my house, which had panels of light on the ceiling. So basically what's called universal lighting, not like spotlights, but like planes of light, fields of light. And so these poles were well illuminated because they were able to receive light, strong light from all different directions. Now, and they responded well. They didn't wash out. They came alive. Now, I have two poles, 6-foot works by 3-inch diameter, much larger than this, behind me. You can't really see the imagery, unfortunately, but you can get a sense of how the poles can look illuminated from below. But every different way that you illuminate them, you get different light effects, fundamentally different effects. If you take them outside, though, so it's interesting, and like in strong sunlight, again, they work well with strong light, so they don't wash out. But the sun doesn't occupy the entire sky. The sun is actually relatively small, right, in the sky itself. And so the sun will cast just a narrow band of light on these poles. In order for these works to be appropriately illuminated, one would really need to light up the entire sky. That would be the circumstance, the environmental circumstance under which these works are meant to be seen. Appreciate it. Well, the way that one would illuminate the sky that we know of is a thermonuclear explosion. So in a sense, once I sort of jokingly referred to the art as thermonuclear art, in that when the entire sky was illuminated, then they would reveal, their true nature, their true aesthetic. Okay. So light has been a preoccupation. It's been a preoccupation of artists. It's been a preoccupation of scientists. It's fundamental to our lives and our thinking, right, about the world. It's fundamental to our sense of understanding. We use lots of metaphors of understanding in relation to light and seeing, right? To see is also to understand, right? If a light goes off when we understand, goes on, right? When we understand something well, it's a powerful source of metaphor and imagery is light. Why? Well, few major reasons. One, we are diurnal creatures, right? We are active in the daytime, fundamentally, and we sleep, rest at night. We're like tree squirrels, right? They are active in the daytime, they sleep at night. Lots of animals, lots of creatures are nocturnal, right? Many of the kinds of rodents, right, are nocturnal. Lots of animals nocturnal because the night can provide safety, right? If you are a creature of the day, as we are, well, vision and light is fundamental, right, to our world, to our survival. Right? In addition, our evolutionary ancestry traces back to trees. Right? That's one of the reasons why I study squirrels so closely. Tree squirrels live in trees. They are mammals that live in trees. We are mammals that, evolutionary thinking is descended from trees. What we are is basically arboreal creatures, tree dwellers, that became terrestrial, living on land, bipedal organisms with a high center of gravity. Much of what we are, much of our physiology, much of our neurophysiology relates to the demands and the opportunities of bipedalism on the ground, walking on two legs, 2 feet, on solid ground, not up in the trees. But our evolutionary descent from trees was not that long ago in evolutionary terms. For creatures living in trees, especially creatures that are diurnal, living in trees, vision and touch are the two fundamental senses. In fact, our sense of touch tends to be underappreciated. I'll leave that for another talk, but certainly vision is fundamental to the experience, to the ability of an organism like ourselves, a large organism living in trees, to survive at all. And that type of survival demands the ability to discern contrast. And our eyes are capable, in general, our brains are capable of seeing in terms of strong contrasts, appreciating the contrast between what's called positive and negative space, a branch of a tree and the air around it. Right? That contrast must be appreciated if one is going to survive in such an environment. And that kind of characterizes the precision and the sharp contrast, of our visual experience of the world. It turns out that light, vision, is so important in our survival, again, evolutionarily, that our eyes are as sensitive as a visual receptor can be designed to be, in terms of the ability to receive individual and respond to and register individual, what are called photons of light. Photons are the fundamental particle of light. I don't want to go into a lot of certain aspects of the physics of light. There are two ways to represent the nature of light. Light can be seen as a wave phenomenon and as a particle. It's often said that light travels through space as a wave, like a water wave. It interacts with matter as a particle. But again, I don't want to explore the details of that right now because we have other things I want to address. But light does, and vision does dominate, right, our sense of the world, the way we represent it. And one thing that I think should be mentioned here that kind of relates to some things that I've talked about in the past. Given how fundamental vision is, to the human experience, to our language, to our metaphors of understanding, the question arises, well, what about the blind? What about those people who are born blind? How is it that they can even engage in in discussions, how is it that they can communicate using terms, color terms, without having any direct experience, of the object about which they're speaking, or the phenomenon, that they're referring to, whenever, light, or vision, or color, or form, visual form is discussed. Well, the answer to that relates to, again, something that we discussed previously, and that was explored by philosopher Wittgenstein, namely that the meaning of a word is the use of that word, not the object for which the word stands. And the ability of the blind to discuss, to even have like such words, as red and blue and green in their vocabulary, and to use it without, with understanding, to use it in such a way that we know what they are saying, points to that circumstance, that it's not the object for which the word stands that gives the word its meaning. It is the use in a whole form of life. So the ability of the blind to discuss color points to a traditional misunderstanding of how words mean and how language functions. Okay, so light is fundamental to our survival, our existence, our metaphors, our metaphors of, our most important metaphors about understanding, right? It's represented, obviously, at the beginning of some of our most important religious traditions. The Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition begins with the creation of the world in terms of the invocation of light. Let there be light. And so it's not surprising that there's been a strong spiritual significance attached to the experience of light. One of the realms in which this experience, the spirituality of light, has been most strongly embraced and communicated is in the Gothic cathedral. The Gothic cathedral is a product of basically the 12th and 13th centuries in Europe, especially in France, though Gothic architecture spread throughout Europe and beyond. The impulse of Gothic architecture, let me show you what I am talking about, if you're not totally familiar. Here is, and if you can see that well, that is the interior of Amiens Cathedral. That is one of the great Gothic cathedrals. It's in France, city of Amiens. That Chartres, Reims, are considered among the greatest achievements of Gothic architecture. Well, Gothic architecture was motivated by an interest in representing, in recreating, in realizing on earth, in this world, the city of God. It was an attempt to represent what the kingdom of heaven would be like. So that when you entered a Gothic cathedral, you were entering a transfigured space, a space that could communicate something of the essence of the experience of God himself, herself, itself, in a supernal way, in a transcendent way. It was interested in achieving, the experience of transcendence here and now. And how did it do that? By focusing on two main features. One was the proportions of the interior. The mathematical proportions represented a means of communicating something of the mind of God. That God thought in terms of mathematical precisions. The other way that the Gothic cathedral attempted to recreate the city of God, the kingdom of heaven, was through light. If you look at Gothic cathedrals, if you study about them, the most important aspect of the cathedral was the fact that the heavy walls that had characterized the earlier modes of architecture, like Romanesque architecture, the heavy walls that were needed for the support, of the structure are now effectively eliminated. And you have these vaults that are held up by what are called flying buttresses, outside supports, external supports, that allow the Gothic cathedral to achieve something of the skeletal structure of a modern skyscraper. But a modern skyscraper, modern building, achieves that by means of steel, like the kinds of materials that are available now. In the era in which, the Middle Ages, when Gothic architecture was being developed, those materials were not available. So other approaches had to be pursued in order to create a skeletal structure that was mostly basically space, that would allow light to enter. But it wasn't just normal light, because this interior was meant to represent the city of God, a transfigured space, something different, fundamentally different from life on earth as it's normally experienced, normally encountered. Well, that's where the stained glass window comes in. All of these interior spaces that now could be occupied by windows, all these walls that were now basically screens, transparent screens or translucent screens, covered, filled with stained glass, designs, representations of saints or important moments in the history of the Christian tradition. The most important thing that light was doing was being transformed. The interior space had a hallucinatory almost aspect, again, a transfigured aspect, because the light was a non-natural light. And its non-natural characteristic was achieved by means of that stained glass. So again, the Gothic cathedral is a monument to light, but transfigured light and proportion, all in an attempt to represent something of the experience of transcendence of, again, the city of God. The part of that understanding, by the way, comes from someone that I studied in college. I actually, when I was in college, I was mostly taking philosophy courses, some religion courses, a lot of science courses, because I ended up going into medicine, molecular biology as well, but also art history courses. I would try to take an art history course once a semester, at least once a year. And one semester, I took a course on Gothic architecture. And in that course, we read a book. The book that most impressed me, most engaged me, was a book on the Gothic cathedral, written by a German scholar who had spent a lot of time at American universities. His name was Otto von Simpson. He had been at Princeton as an eminent art historian. His book explored the philosophical ground, the philosophical motivation for the Gothic cathedral in terms similar to what I just described, right? In terms of light and proportion, transfigured light, to give a sense of transcendence. The semester after I took that course, it turned out Otto von Simpson came to Harvard and taught actually a course on 19th century German art, which I ended up taking. It was designed for graduate students, but I wanted to take that course simply because I wanted to, have a more direct experience of this professor who had written this book that was so extraordinary. There are lots of stories I could tell you about those encounters, but again, I will leave that for another time too. But I wanted to acknowledge Otto von Simpson as providing extraordinary insight into the nature of the Gothic cathedral, one of the great artistic achievements of Western civilization, really. Now, the transfigured light of the Gothic cathedral finds a new representation in the work of another extraordinary artist, one of the great artists, again, in the history of Western culture, and that is Vermeer, a Dutch painter, considered by many to be the single greatest painter of the Western tradition. There was a time when Vermeer's Head of a Young Girl, it's usually called, or Girl with a Pearl Earring, a movie was made about it, starring Scarlett Johansson. There was a time when that painting was in Los Angeles on display, and that was one of the most valuable works, one of the most valuable objects ever in the city of Los Angeles. It's considered the Mona Lisa of the North. Well, Vermeer was interested in the phenomenon of light, and I want to show you how the Gothic cathedral experience is secularized, made into, it's taken out of its Christian context and given, well, a more contemporary kind of feel. Here's the work. Now, let me show you this, if you can see that. Now, notice, there's a window on one side. It's not stained glass. It's natural light that's coming in. But that natural light plays against the wall. The wall is the most important element of the work. And the wall has a spiritual presence, a spiritual radiance. So in the art of Vermeer, light, but not transfigured, natural light, entering a simple interior, a simple Dutch interior, a simple middle-class Dutch interior is able to elevate that interior to, again, an experience of transcendence. But again, it's what light achieves. So Vermeer is linked to that tradition that the Gothic cathedral explored of light transfiguring and achieving a transcendence, through how it plays across surfaces and through what it suggests, what it reveals, what it represents, what it inspires. Okay, now, light So clearly, light is one of the elements in art. It's manipulated in art. It is a focus of a great deal of art. It's certainly a focus of mine. It's also been important in philosophy and science. One of the remarkable figures in the history of philosophy is Spinoza, a Dutch philosopher. As Vermeer was a Dutch painter, they lived around the same time in the 17th century. Spinoza was one of the most precise thinkers in the history of philosophy. His works, especially his ethics, his great achievement, his magnum opus, was written in the form of a mathematical treatise, almost like a textbook or a discourse in geometry. There are assumptions, axioms, there are theorems that are proved, all about the nature of this world, the nature of God, of deity, the nature of causality. It was Spinoza was one of these comprehensive thinkers who was interested in conveying a comprehensive vision of the world and of a philosophical analysis and representation of that world, of this world. Well, so Spinoza was renowned for the precision of his thought. He was also, I think, Einstein's favorite philosopher. Spinoza happened to be Jewish. That may have been part of what engaged Einstein, but in any case, Einstein, I'm sure, admired the precision of Spinoza's thought and writing, the way he represented his ideas. Spinoza, in his lifetime, was internationally famous, and he had offers to teach philosophy at all the leading European universities. He turned them all down. Spinoza had a profession aside from the writing of philosophy. He had a profession by which he earned his living, and he remained devoted to that profession even as he was internationally celebrated. That profession was that of a lens grinder. Spinoza made lenses. Okay? Now, this is the 17th century, early 17th century. This is soon after the invention of the telescope. So there was a lot of interest in optical devices, and Spinoza was captivated by the precision of the process, the precision of light and of the bending of the light by lenses cohered with the precision of Spinoza's philosophic thinking. And just to give you a feel, here is, if you can see that well, that right there is Spinoza's apartment, and that is the apparatus that he used to grind lenses. Okay? As I said, Spinoza remained devoted to that, throughout his productive philosophical career, because it appealed to the demands, similar demands that his writing of philosophy made upon him. Okay? So, again, we see that philosophy is interested in precision. It's interested in bringing clarity. It's interested in illuminating, subjects. And the embodiment of that is the life and the work and the experience of Spinoza, one of the first order philosophers in the Western tradition, one of the greatest philosophers, to ever write. Okay? So there we see that the phenomenon of light and the precision of the lens making activity engaged Spinoza again as much as his philosophical writings did. They complemented each other. Now, just as Spinoza was a 17th century figure, fascinated by this, new interest in lenses and telescopes and optical devices, another major figure was as well Newton. Newton is most known today for his work in gravitation, in writing the Principia, which established basically Newtonian physics, the physics that was primarily responsible for guiding the Apollo 11 astronauts to the moon. Celestial mechanics basically is Newtonian mechanics. Newton actually was celebrated by a poet, Ben Jonson, who wrote, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. Then God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." That was how Newton was seen. He was seen, by the time Newton died, he was the most famous person in Europe. But Newton's early interest, and one of his dominant interests throughout his life really, was optics, the nature of light, and the nature of optical devices that were at that time just being invented. Newton did a lot of work, a lot of experimentation with prisms that showed that white light was made up of a rainbow of colors. He was the first person to explain, how objects had or displayed the colors that they do. That it was a matter of that if white light is shined at an object, the object would absorb some lights of the spectrum, some colors of the rainbow, and reflect others. The object that we see, the color that we see an object revealing itself as, is what the object is reflecting, not absorbing. So Newton was the first person to explain that aspect of the experience of color. Newton did a lot of work also investigating, his work with prisms was connected with the nature of the lenses that people like Spinoza were designing, and were grinding. But lenses behave like prisms to some degree. They separate colors into a rainbow of hues. That phenomenon of a lens splitting like white light into a rainbow is called chromatic aberration. It's a problem. It's a problem in the design of the kind of lenses that, again, Spinoza was making. Newton sought an alternative, and the alternative was the reflecting telescope. That the telescope that Galileo, in the early telescopes, and they're still prominent, it's called a refracting telescope. It has a lens called well, has a lens that is basically taking in light. A lens takes in a lot of light from a source and then will focus it on another lens and create an image. A refracting telescope basically will have like a series of lenses in a row. And the main lens is receiving the light. The more light the main lens receives, the better the detail one can observe in an object, if that object is magnified. Newton, realizing that these lenses were always going to create these color effects that were a problem, when you're observing like astronomical objects, came upon the idea of using not a lens to collect light, but a mirror. And a mirror has an advantage in that it's easier to make than a lens. So Newton made the first what's called reflecting telescope, using not a lens to collect light, but a mirror. And then directing the light that mirror collected to an actual lens that would then allow for the observation of the image. And here is, let me show you, here's the actual telescope that Newton built by hand. Okay? Newton was mechanically gifted. He was able to build things like mechanical devices. He was able to construct that telescope by hand. It still exists. Well, Newton was proud of the telescope, and he was also proud of his theories of optics, of how objects derive their color. He was also proud of the theory he had developed of light as being particulate, being made of little particles that would travel through space in straight lines, which actually ran counter to the prevailing theory of how light traveled, namely the theory that light traveled through space as waves, again, like water waves. Newton was so proud of his results that he contacted the Royal Society in London. It was the first major scientific organization established to share and promote scientific ideas and discoveries. He told the Royal Society, he was at Cambridge. He was a professor at Cambridge. He contacted the Royal Society, and they welcomed him to London to show his telescope, and he was delighted to do so. So he traveled down to London, and when the telescope was displayed for the members of the Royal Society, Newton was applauded. Okay? He was embraced. Everyone recognized the value and the advantages of the instrument. Well, Newton then asked if he could read a paper, on the nature of light, and it's called the corpuscular theory, that light was made of particles, not waves. Was given the opportunity to read the paper before the society. That reading was met with laughter and ridicule, because the ideas ran counter to not just the prevailing ideas of the time, but the ideas embraced by Robert Hooke, who was the president of the Royal Society. Newton was not a social person by nature. He was humiliated, was horrified by the experience. He left England, he left London resolving never to publish anything again. It was a fateful encounter with the Royal Society and a fateful resolve on Newton's part. For a generation, Newton sat on results in calculus, results on the theory of gravitation, results that would eventually establish modern physics or pre-20th century physics, create Newtonian physics, create that revolution in thinking that had led Ben Jonson to describe the light that Newton brought into the world. Well, for a generation, Newton did nothing about those results until, and I've told this story from this point before, about Halley, the diplomat, amateur astronomer, the person from Halley's Comet is named, sought out Newton some 20 years later, went to Newton to see if maybe he had a solution to the current primary problem in astronomy of the time, how to explain, how to account for Kepler's laws of motion, and in particular, why planets would move in ellipses, not circles, and what the relationship between that motion and a force, like an inverse square force, might be. When Halley went to Newton and asked Newton about that problem, like if we have an inverse square law of gravitation, what type of orbit will a planet move in? Newton's immediate response was an ellipse. That was the response everybody was hoping to hear. But the question is, like, why? What would account for that? And Halley asked him, how do you know this? And Newton responded, I proved it. He proved it years earlier. Well, Halley was astonished and said to Newton, well, if you could generate that proof, this would be, or reproduce it or something, this would be of first-rate importance. Well, Newton did eventually. Halley ultimately guided Newton through the process of writing the Principia. He financed the work. He dealt successfully with Newton's very difficult personality. Without that encounter, without that relationship, we might never have had modern science. We might never, the majority of us, have ever been born because we would not have had possibly an industrial revolution. It was a decisive moment and engagement in the history of world civilization, world culture. But it almost didn't come about because of the response to Newton's theory of light that ran counter to what Robert Hooke was advocating at the time. Okay, so I just wanted to say a few more things. We are not going to be able, I see, to have enough time to explore enlightenment. We will do that next time. But let me just finish up with some remarks about Einstein and the sun. Okay? Einstein was preoccupied with the phenomenon of light. When he was a young boy, he was thinking about light, the speed of light. What would the experience be like if one was traveling faster than the speed of light? He asked himself, questions like that. Eventually, those questions would lead to the theory of relativity. The theory of relativity has two parts. It has a part called the special theory of relativity and the general theory of relativity. The special theory ultimately produced E equals mc squared. The general theory gave rise to a theory of gravitation that basically went beyond the work of Newton's, which had revealed certain limitations experimentally. The test of that general theory of relativity that ultimately made Einstein an international celebrity occurred in 1919. And it was a prediction that it related to a prediction that Einstein made that since space was curved, was a thing, not just an emptiness, that space is curved, light traveling through space would travel in the curvature of that space. And the curvature was greater in the vicinity of strong gravitational fields, such as the sun could produce. That only that intensity of gravitational field produced by an object that massive could produce enough discernible curvature in space, and space-time, it was called at this point, to be observable and experimentally validatable. Well, in order to observe light in the vicinity of the sun, basically what you're doing is you're observing stars close to the sun and seeing if their positions are altered because of the gravitational field that the sun is creating. But objects, stars close to the sun, can only be observed if the sun is not as flaming bright as it normally is. Well, the opportunity for that occurs during a solar eclipse, a total solar eclipse. The test of the general theory of relativity was in what occurred on the occasion of a solar eclipse in 1919. And I just want to show you. Here it is. Here's the image of that actual eclipse in 1919 of the sun that validated Einstein, or was the most important experimental validation of Einstein's general theory of relativity, and led to international headlines that Newton's work, which had been celebrated for centuries, had now been revised. Okay? We had gone beyond it. And the person responsible was a physicist, Albert Einstein. It's an example of actually how extremity is so decisive in advancing thought. The sun is the most extreme phenomenon in our environment. Napoleon once said, if I were to embrace a religion, I would worship the sun. And obviously, the Egyptian civilization did just that, right? In, again, desert environment, the sun is one of the dominant sort of force and factor, in one's experience. But here's something interesting about the sun in terms of its philosophical import. And I will, I think, just about soon close with this. Yes. If you ask yourself, well, there are on the sun sunspots, right? The first person to see sunspots, and these are dark spots on the surface of the sun, the first person to see them, describe them, use them to determine the rotation of the sun was Galileo. It's why he went blind. He observed the sun through his telescope, okay? He drew sunspots and described them. Well, if I would ask people, in the sky, beyond the clouds, the brightest object is the sun. What's the second brightest object? And most people say, the moon. And I say, no, it's not the moon, and I will give you a hint. It's black. The second brightest object beyond the clouds in the sky, as seen from the earth, the brightest is the sun, the second brightest is black. Well, it's a little bit of a trick question. The answer is a sunspot. If you take a sunspot out of the surface of the sun and imagine putting it in space, apart from the sun, it would be brighter than the full moon. Well, a large enough sunspot. Anyway, the only reason why the sunspot appears black is because it's against the ground of the surface of the sun, which is so much hotter. Okay? A sunspot is several thousand degrees cooler than the surrounding surface, and so it appears black. I wrote an aphorism about that is central to our philosophical experience and understanding of the world. And the aphorism is, properties are reversible as the color of sunspots. In other words, we think in terms of like black, well, our thinking is guided by certain precisions. And one of the fundamental precisions of thinking is in terms of the contrast of black and white, right? It's really at the foundation of computer technology, computer language, on and off, black and white, right? Oppositions, fundamental oppositions. But the sun shows us that even as fundamental an opposition as black and white is not so, that one can transform into the other, depending upon the nature of the context. And that context can be a spatial context, or it can be a temporal context in terms of time. And that relates to how it is that the future decides the past and can reverse it in the same way as properties are reversible as the color of sunspots. Okay, I think we will end on that note. So again, that means that next time I will transition from light to a discussion and exploration of enlightenment. But for now, I want to first address we had one question last time, so let me first go to that. And that question, let me just read it, is, if I was a German soldier, I might think we also have such masterpieces too, or such a masterpiece as the Leningrad Symphony. Because remember last time I was talking about Victory Day, and I was talking in particular about the siege of Leningrad and how Shostakovich composed the Leningrad Symphony, which was performed in Leningrad a year into the siege, when the population was starving, the musicians were starving, the city was surrounded by German forces that were intent upon starving the city to death, extinguishing its population, and how during the performance of that symphony, loudspeakers were directed towards the German troops so they could hear the music of the symphony. A symphony which was one of the longest ever written, which required an enormous orchestra, okay, and which reduced the German soldiers, as later accounts have revealed, to tears, and also convinced them that they would not win the war. Okay? Because the idea was that if a people under siege, under these most dire circumstances, could produce such music, they could not be defeated. Okay? And it worked well. So, in terms of the question, Germany has many talented and gifted musicians. What do I think about that? Yes, Germany clearly has musicians even more gifted, right? Two of the three greatest composers are considered to be Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, often the third. Mozart was Austrian, but part of that Austrian Germanic culture too. And those composers are in a special category. As great as Stravinsky, as great as Shostakovich, Beethoven, Mozart, Bach are typically considered to be the greatest of all composers, and again, part of the Germanic tradition. But the reason that the Leningrad Symphony and its performance had such an impact on the German soldiers was because Mozart and Bach and Beethoven had not composed their works under siege conditions, and their works had not been performed, after having been composed in such dire circumstances. So it was the contrast between, here we go back to fundamental issues of contrast that govern so much of our thinking, so much of our experience of light, right? And discussions of the nature of light. It was the contrast between the power and commitment, of the music and of the people to its performance and the circumstances in which they found themselves. That was so stirring and so transformative for the war experience. It elevated the morale, of the people of Russia, and it was fundamentally unnerving to the Germans to see what a people under siege were capable of. And remember, this was a year into the siege, so the conditions in Leningrad were horrific. And nevertheless, they were able to generate such a work of art, perform it, and broadcast it. Okay. Now, do we have any other questions? I don't know if we have too much time. Is there another question?
One more time, thank you very much, Steven, for such an amazing talk. Thank you for the talks, Steven. Thank
So,
okay. So one more time, thank you very much. Yeah, I think there was something.
Oops. I think I've lost Aaliyah.
Steven, okay, yes. We're here.
Okay.
Super. So one more time, thank you very much, Steven, for such an amazing talk, and thank you for dedicating these philosophical talks. Unfortunately, our time is up, but let me quickly read out the questions and the comments that we have for today's session. Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. And there is a question from Daniel. What about other Shakespeare's tragedies, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet? Okay, thank you for your question. Thank you, Leila, for joining us, and thank you for the question. Her question is the light has certain impact on human in both mental and physical aspects?
Okay.
Thank you, Leila, for your question. Then the next question again from our guest, Daniel. Light is a way to survive. I agree. Also, it's a way to be healthy. Yesterday, I used therapy with using ultraviolet light warming my chest. What do you think about this? Okay. The next one. And there is also one thing. Harry Potter Part 3. Speech of Albus Dumbledore about light in the beginning of the movie. What do you think? Do you agree with him? Okay, thank you, Daniel. The next question. And the strange thing that it wasn't in the book. So we may think that it was imagination of director of movies. So what do you think, that the director had sent their own idea through the movie? And then the next thing, if I'm not mistaken, when Nazis were in Germany, they rejected Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart. What do you think about it?
Okay, we'll talk about that. Yes.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your questions. Steven will definitely address them next week. And unfortunately, our time is up, but one more time, we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty. And thank you very much, Steven. It's our amazing speaker. Thank you very much for having us today. And thank you all, guys, for your comments, your feedback, and the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I hope to see you next week. So have a good week and please join us again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stay safe and see you next week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.